Good morning, Volker. Thank you for
Good
joining.
morning, Tanya. A pleasure to meet you again. So
I'm really
great.
happy to be here and to learn about the progress of worldwide biodiversity. But to welcome our guests who are already in this room, can you tell us a bit what can people expect from today's conference?
I think we have a fascinating program. And I mean, this is not our first international conference we are doing, but in contrast to the previous ones, this time we will give more time to discuss. So we won't have so many different presentations. We will have much more time for discussion. I think this is at the point where we are right now is quite important. So the topic is about the big challenge, how we can reverse the trend of biodiversity loss. This is the big question. And we all know it's a difficult time for all those who fight for biodiversity protection. So we focus on conflicts that hamper actually a protection of biodiversity. I mean, on a biological side or ecological perspective. So I think we know pretty much what we should do, but we cannot really do what the ecologists and scientists say what we should do to protect biodiversity, and because we have so many different conflicts. So the conference focuses clearly on how to solve conflicts of interest. So it's not only about biological solutions, it's about systemic solutions, how we can satisfy the needs of ecologists, the needs of the society, and also the needs of economy, of course. So this is the overall topic. And we have a program, I think, that is interesting. We start with a fantastic opening of our new Ministry of Science and Education. You know, we had a turmoil here in Germany, and now we have a new Minister of Science and Education. He will give an opening speech, and then we have David Obura, great person, IPBES chair, and then David um, um, Sukhdev, who gives the really opening speech. And then we start later with a program where we, in the first session, we focus on the various strategies for biodiversity conservation and environmental. No, this is in the afternoon, about the different projects and ideas we have about valuation of nature. You know, when you protect biodiversity, when you protect nature, it very much depends on what the value of nature you have in mind. Is it really important, or is it just a nice to have? And
And
in
if it's
FEdA, we had a major program just about the various ideas about valuation. And in the afternoon, then it's about environmental justice. I mean, it's easy to say I want to protect biodiversity, but this may harm a lot of. If you just say this is a conservation area, no one can go in, no one can use the nature, then you do a lot of harm to other people. So in the afternoon, it's more about the question about environmental justice. And the next day, land sharing and land sparing, an very important issue. We still don't know what is the best strategy. We think actually we need both. We need land sparing, conservation strategies, and sustainable use. And the last part is then about transformation processes. So I think we cover a lot of different aspects, but it's all
most
about how to overcome conflicts.
Most definitely, and I think if we're in the middle of all these conflicts in Germany by with the farmers and herders talking about the wolf approaching, giving them a lot of conflicts, with a lot of
Yeah.
fights for new national parks in Germany, people saying no, we don't want this, others saying we want this. So I think it's a very going very close to not just scientists but also people who are involved in nature protection, conservation all over. Germany, Europe, and the world, I think. I would like to ask you but about the number of participants, because we're quite a few people from all over the world. But before, I would like to invite all the participants to use the chat now, just to tell us from where you're joining, and maybe what is your favorite ecosystem that you want to be protected, maybe what's your interest is of research, so that we can have a small idea of who is joining and who is listening to us, as we are not in the in the real life and meeting and chatting in the breakout sessions. So Volker, how many participants, how big is our audience today?
I think in total, as far as I know, so this is the information from yesterday evening, we are about 330 people. And out of these 330 people, we have something like 30 different speakers. And in addition, 20 people that present posters. So out of these 330 people, so about 50% are really actively contributing to this conference, and the rest are part of the discussion later on. We will have in each sessions and forums, we will have a lot of time for discussion.
Hmm. I
So
see. There are people joining from London, from Berlin, and Vienna. I'm waiting for the people from the countryside. Actually, I'm joining from Hamburg, but I come from a little village in Eastern Westphalia. So please add your places from where you're joining. And maybe a last question before we really start very briefly. Your colleague Julian Tafner, he went to Colombia to join the CBD conference of the party. And can you give us a small idea, what did he tell you about the atmosphere there? Is there still hope? Because we have this great Montreal agreement giving us a lot of push for biodiversity, and well, we know the status of politics right now.
I mean, what I learned from Julian, but from other people also, Senckenberg has sent a huge group of people over there, and you could read this in the press. So we have some progress concerning DSI, digital sequence information. We have some progress concerning the rights of indigenous people. But all in all, I mean, this was really a failure. I mean, the program 2 years ago in Montreal was that in this year, 2024, the 196 countries should come with their national plans for protection and conservation of biodiversity and an action plan. And only 44 countries actually had such a plan. And these countries who had a plan still could only fulfill about 50 to 60% of what the goal was in 2022 in Montreal, with the 23 targets for the global biodiversity framework. So if we look at what we really want to achieve, so this was a failure, we have to admit it.
Okay, that's a good point to start now, as it's
Yeah.
9:30 and
Okay.
gives us a lot of weight for this conference. We need to speed up with the protection of biodiversity. Thank you so
Absolutely.
much, Volker Mosbrugger. You can lean back and listen to your conference
I
now.
will.
And a very, very warm welcome to FEdA's International Conference of 2024. I'm really excited to be your moderator again, as I'm a German journalist writing a lot about biodiversity, sustainability, and also agriculture, the use of soils in Germany. And for years, I've been looking for an answer to this very important questions. How can we reverse the loss of biodiversity? And Volker Mosbrugger already told us the situation is, well, it's not getting better, not yet. And for so many years, political leaders have been signing treaties to stop the extinction of species, knowing that it's not only important for the species, but it's also important for us, for the humans, as we need the diversity of nature to survive on this planet. So, as we know, little progress has been made, even though we have this great agreement of Montreal that says, yes, humanity has, has decided to save nature. Today, we will learn about successful practices, and I hope this will give us a little bit of hope in the discussion. And I'm really looking forward to learn about these good examples. Now, I'm really excited to announce that the minister, the German federal minister for education and research, will give us an opening speech with his video message. And if you feel like you're familiar with his name and have heard his name in the context of agriculture and food, you're right, because he is also our Minister for Agriculture and Food. And we had some recent changes in the government, and now he took over also the Ministry for Research and Education. And as a double minister, he will give us his welcoming speech. So we're really excited to listen to Cem Özdemir right now.
Hello, everyone. Perhaps out of time sync, but heartfelt all the same. Welcome to the conference. As Federal Minister of Food and Agriculture, I have dealt with the issue of biodiversity for a long time. I have recently become the wearer of two hats, as it were, and now it is my pleasure twice over to welcome you all on behalf of the Federal Ministry of Education and Research and the Research Initiative for the Conservation of Biodiversity. There is one number that always comes to mind when I think of biodiversity: 80%. 80% of natural habitats here in Europe are in critical condition. This has wide-reaching consequences both for humans and the environment. The twin crises of climate change and biodiversity can no longer be ignored. We are impelled to take action. No doubt about it. We need intact ecosystems with high levels of biodiversity. These are the basis of our very existence. Our future depends on their protection. This was the top priority for the parties to the Convention on Biological Diversity when they met in the Colombian city of Cali a few weeks ago. We saw several positive developments in Cali and beyond. The European Union has taken a very important step with the Nature Restoration Law and its objectives: to gradually restore destroyed habitats, to foster biodiversity, while also achieving our climate goals. All of this instills hope. And in my current dual role, I can say how important it is that we find a balance between protecting nature and other societal interests such as agriculture. Something that we're already discussing intensely here in Germany and must continue to do so in the future, just like in many other countries too. Only by addressing these issues together, we will find feasible solutions. The Federal Research Ministry plays a key role in this with the Research Initiative for Conservation of Biodiversity. It defines the framework so that we can generate knowledge crucial for making decisions about how to better protect biodiversity. The federal government's future research and innovation strategy also focuses on the question of how to sustainably feed the global population without endangering biodiversity and climate action measures. We want to develop multifunctional land use policies. And that means we want environmental protection, agriculture, and business to work with each other, not against each other. Research and innovation are crucial to this, and most importantly, the successful transfer of research into practice. This requires close cooperation, both at the local level and internationally. This global dimension is extremely relevant. As you all know, what we do at home can have an impact on biodiversity on the other side of the world. The reverse is also true. The word telecoupling in the title of today's conference is a reminder of this. Nature knows no borders, and we too must now overcome our borders, whether national or mental, and take decisive action together. On this note, I would like to wish you all the best for your discussions during this conference. Take care.
Thank you so much, Cem Özdemir, also for reminding us of the interlinkages between all living beings on this planet in the era of the Anthropocene. Now, I have the honor to announce someone who knows this very, very well. He is the award-winning chair of the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services that you all know as IPBES or IPBES or however you call it. He was also the co-chair of IPBES Nexus assessment on the interlinkages between biodiversity and human needs. And he is also founding director of CORDIO, which is the Coastal Oceans Research and Development in the Indian Ocean. He started his scientific career by exploring what could help coral reefs to survive or to become more resilient. And now he's focusing more and more on what the minister just described on the interlinkages between the ecosystems and the human needs and how they could divide and live better together and share this ecosystem and help it to become more resilient, not by just staying away, but living with and within these ecosystems. So let's welcome David Obura, and thank you so much for being with us and giving your insights and your great insights of your career, taking you from the coral reefs to all over the world, being connected with all these scientists that follow your way of linking humans and ecosystems. I'm really, really looking forward to your speech. Over to you, David.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Tanja, for that kind introduction. It's a pleasure to speak to you all. Good morning. I suppose most people maybe in the morning in Germany. So I'd like to thank Dr. Mosbrugger and the other organizers for inviting me to give this talk. It's certainly a privilege to follow your minister, and it's wonderful to hear of the integration between nature and agriculture that is underway. It is very much in line, or the topic of the Nexus assessment, as was just mentioned. I'll come back to that. It's also a great pleasure for me as the chair of IPBES to be speaking for you. This is I guess the German network for research, because of the great support that Germany does provide to IPBES in so many ways, whether it's through supporting the Secretariat and a lot of our work. The Senckenberg itself, of course, supports a lot of aspects of our work, task forces, and some of our meetings. I've been to several there myself. And then, of course, the overlap in our research communities, participation of German researchers in IPBES assessments and task forces and the various bodies we have is very high. And I see many familiar names in the list. So it's a pleasure to speak to you all as well. So the topic of this workshop, of course, is of great interest to me personally, and then, of course, for IPBES as well. But reversing biodiversity loss, and particularly noting the breadth of interactions or the breadth of issues that surround this, the conflicts, telecoupling, and successful practices. My own interests in the breadth of this topic really came to the fore through the negotiations of the Global Biodiversity Framework a few years ago, in which I worked with many colleagues, some here as well, in providing science inputs to help try and strengthen the Global Biodiversity Framework and to help the negotiators develop a strong framework. It became very clear from a lot of the research that is being published around the time that it takes a lot more than just biodiversity actions or nature actions to conserve biodiversity. It takes production and consumption actions as well, or we could say economy and society actions too, in terms of addressing the interactions that we have with nature. And that in my own work, we really focused on the importance of first addressing also the drivers of nature's decline, because otherwise the conservation actions are fighting an uphill battle the whole time. But then addressing these drivers also requires really addressing very profound equity and societal issues at the same time to address those drivers. Now, this, of course, is the core of IPBES's work. For those of you who are familiar with our conceptual framework, these terms, the direct and indirect drivers of decline, the nature's contributions to people, what we extract from nature, the benefit sharing of the benefits derived from nature, from economic activities. are part and parcel of our conceptual framework. This was developed was published in 2015. It took 2 or 3 years of negotiations and discussions to develop it. But in 2015 was the same year as the Sustainable Development Goals were negotiated and agreed amongst the countries. And of course, the parallels between these two frameworks are very high. They come from the same principles of sustainable development. They just reflect different communities of practice. So scientists on the one hand, or knowledge holders dealing with integration of knowledge and the IPBES side, and then of course the policymakers in the countries dealing with the very difficult issues of governance and development and implementation on the other. And I think it's very useful, and I see it really threaded through the various sessions and the titles of this conference, the complexity of interactions in both of these frameworks, whether you look from the framing of IPBES's conceptual framework or the SDGs or sustainable development, nature, economy, and society as a whole. These aspects are threaded through all the various discussions that you're having. And I think that's incredibly important, because if we just look at nature on its own, we don't address all the things that are, that either we benefit from or that we are impacting nature with. Being the chair of IPBES now, I feel it's a very privileged position as a scientist in this place, because I get to look at all the findings from our assessments that have come out over the last few years. And of course, there have been 11 assessments, 2 workshop reports. The assessments are really given a mandate by our country members, of which there are now almost 150, to address these topics that are of high priority globally, and that emerge from local contexts and national contexts to be important globally. And so I get to look at the integration of all of these findings in a way that I've never had the time or the inclination to look at before. And I see so much of value that is very integrative. And I think I see that coming out in the workshop and discussions coming up. I think one thing that's very interesting to me is looking at sustainable development and really understanding nature, economy, and society as the 3 sort of core parts of our global or our modern world. We have tended to focus on these 3 somewhat in isolation, looking at nature or loss of nature. We look at economic viability, or we look at society and equity and governance issues. But I think there's a lot more richness to be gained from focusing on the flows. And this is the dynamism, this is the telecoupling, and this is the conflicts that you're addressing in the conference. We look at the loops and the feedbacks. This is exactly what the Nexus assessment has been looking at, in that we're bringing to our plenary next week, as well as transformative change assessment, which is looking at the social values and how society really, makes decisions on the basis of the values that we have. I think it's very powerful, and maybe this will come through the various discussions that you'll have, looking at 2 feedback loops. And I think one is between nature and economy, because there are the direct interactions we have with nature. We extract commodities, or we extract natural resources, monetize them and use them. And that's what is pulling so much out of nature. And then the reverse connection is from economy to nature. These are the direct drivers that push nature into decline. The second loop is between economy and society, how we share the benefits from our economic activities to society, to all members of society, whether we do that well or poorly, but then also the values that we have in society and how they determine how we promulgate our economic activities, the actions that we take, if we internalize or externalize costs and so on. So I think understanding these 2 loops and how they interact with each other is very important, because then we can ask a question about, do we value balance across this system? What are the value systems or perspectives around the world that really emphasize balance across all of these? Or do we value linear maximization of just extraction of commodities and value and wealth, and that wealth accumulates only in certain places? So I think the title of the conference, very much speaks to these various issues. I think it's very much in line with and complementary with what we focus on in IPBES. I'll be very interested to hear findings from this, and I'm sure I'll hear some of the feedback from some of the participants in the conference and the workshop. And then I hope that this will come out maybe 2 weeks after the workshop. It will be very useful, as we really hope that these two assessments, the Nexus and Transformative Change assessments that are plenary in Windhoek in Namibia starting next Monday, where our governments will really look at the science and the synthesis that our teams have put together, really discuss and reflect on the implications of that science and how we derive relevant policy from those scientific findings, so we can approve these reports. We'll hopefully release them on the 17th and 18th of December in media releases, and then they could be available to the global community next year for the scientists to look at and reflect on, but then also, of course, for policymakers and actors across society to really use their findings in very tangible ways to reverse biodiversity loss, to minimize conflicts, and to really work out the necessary practices for a sustainable future, a sustainable and just future for all of us. So it's a pleasure and an honor to have been able to reflect on this from IPBES. I hope that's useful, and I look forward to hearing how the workshop progresses. So thank you very much. Can't hear you.
So now it should be working. Can you hear me now? I hope so. Thank you so much, David, for giving us kind of hope in, let's say, in a difficult time. And I can see people applauding here in this room of the meeting organizers to your speech. I wish I could give you the feeling of the audience, but I think you really gave us hope that all over the world, scientists and also governments appreciating the work of scientists, and scientists are working together to see these interlinkages and not to talk simply about nature somewhere remote from people, but all these interlinkages. And I can tell you also, we journalists try to point this out, and whenever we write about economy, we talk about the integration of externalities, and we hope so that this will help so much. I don't see any questions, but I see that Pavan Sukhdev is already here, so I think we can proceed to our keynote with this wonderful start by Cem Özdemir and David Obura. And now I invite you to ask questions by using the Q&A tool, not the chat. The chat is just for telling us from where you're joining and listening to the technical advice from the Lindman technical team. But please use Q&A for your questions, and I'm going to pass these questions over to our next speakers. So now it's time for the keynote, for our keynote of today, by a famous sustainability thinker who both knows the world of biodiversity, but also of economy and finance. He was the chair and the president of WWF International. He also was a managing director at the German finance institution Deutsche Bank. He led two famous UN reports, the TEEP report, which is the economies of ecosystems and biodiversities, which for the first time, I think, tried to give a financial value to biological diversity. And he was also involved in UNEP's report towards a green economy. So again, he is trying to figure out ways that kind of make biological diversity be part of the economic system that until now it kind of ignores biological values. Today he is the CEO of Just Impact, and that is a company that provides ESG data, so also data on sustainability, etc., and of course biodiversity, to investment companies and also to people who care about valuing the economic value of companies by taking in consideration their influence on biodiversity. So you can see we have a keynote speaker with a really broad experience on sustainability, on the world of economy and biodiversity and how it is interlinked. He is also a goodwill ambassador to the United Nations for the environment program. And with this really huge experience, he will give us his idea on our question, how can we reverse biodiversity loss? So the floor is yours. A very, very warm welcome to Pavan Sukhdev. Thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you so much, Tanya, for your kind introduction. And thank you, David, for setting the stage so nicely for what I'm here to talk about, which is some honest truths about the challenge of reversing nature loss. And since I have the privilege of running this company, which is about data, I've actually made use of some of our data and shared it with you in public for perhaps the first time. So as the theme of this conference suggests, clearly effects at a distance are quite important. Perhaps where I will focus on is how important and what can be done about them. And I was at Kali, as many of you were, and it just struck me that this whole idea of indirect impacts and non-proximate impacts and the role of the corporation in driving the economy in a direction which generates loss of ecosystems and species diversity. This really wasn't a theme. Of the 23,000 people at the Kali COP, perhaps 1,000 were technologists. I actually felt as if I had met all of them, because they was constantly barraging me, knowing that I run a data company. You know, why can't you take this data and that system and this and so on? But I think the focus was very much on learning more and more in great detail using advanced technology and drone technology and artificial intelligence, pattern recognition technology, to find out more and more about locations and species, but actually not very much about what is it that's driving biodiversity loss. So let me begin there. Can you all see my screen? And you're familiar with the work that's been launched by the World Business Council for Sustainable Development, and very much involved Marco Lambertini and my friends and ex-colleagues from WWF, of course. And it was about bringing a change in the narrative, a narrative change towards regeneration, and using the term nature positive by 2030 as against reduced loss or reduced rate of loss as it used to be in the old days. And I think that was something that I really appreciated. I think this is the kind of positive narrative that one does need. But the question then goes back to the world of IPBES and before them, even the world of the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment, because these are the big drivers of biodiversity loss around the world. The change in habitats, alterations, deforestation, wetland losses, etc., expanding use and land use change, climate change, and the significance of that cannot be understated. Now, I was in Brazil last week, and of course, the talk of the Amazon is always high. And I was at a session on Virada Sustentável, which was by Sao Paulo's water utility. Again, the talk of the Amazon came up, and I think people understood and realized that at this time, this year, the Amazon is less than 2 kilometers wide. When I visited Manaus, which is 1,450 kilometers up from the Atlantic, when I went there, I think 2016 or 17, it was 8 kilometers wide. And that change is not because of deforestation upstream. It's not because of agricultural land use change. It's not because of more land being used for beef farming and so on and so forth, even though that is bad and does have a negative impact. This was basically due to changing weather patterns and the change in the climate. So it was climate change that was driving. A paper was published by Nobres and the late Professor Lovejoy, sadly passed away a couple of years ago. But their key conclusion in the paper was that climate change was actually what was converting the Amazonian rainforest gradually into grassland. So this is a hugely important thing. Of course, we understand the role of invasive alien species. We understand the excessive exploitation of everything from resources to water, and then the damaging effects of pollution on species and issues like agrochemicals causing eutrophication and so on. So there are many causes. There are many, many drivers of biodiversity loss, understood as the loss of ecosystem, degradation of ecosystems, and the loss of diversity, species diversity, and at some point, even genetic diversity. So these are well recognized. But I think when we look behind who's causing this, like whose habitat change activity, whose climate changing emissions, whose overexploitation, and whose pollution, 4 out of these 5 important drivers, which are from the world of IPBES and the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment, basically are coming from the world of the corporation. So a study was done, actually I had commissioned that as the then vice chair of the Natural Capital Coalition. Study was done by Trucost for us, which indicated the breakdown by sector of the biggest impacts. And the biggest impacts were greenhouse gas emissions. They were air pollutants in terms of the natural capital costs of these emissions. So a sectoral understanding was achieved. And yes, it was about greenhouse gases and land use change and water usage and water and land pollution. And these were the big drivers. And interestingly enough, it is these drivers from the corporate world which are causing many of the planetary boundaries which have a bearing on biodiversity. Biospheric integrity, as it's now referred to in the planetary boundaries scientific language, is affected at the genetic functional level in terms of the land use, in terms of fresh water, and even in terms of ocean acidification by these drivers of those impacts. And how big are they? Well, you can take a guess. The detail is available through a whole range of life cycle impact assessments, and we go into that. But just think for a moment at the macro level. 2/3 of the global economy is private sector. So it should no surprise that something like 2/3 of the impacts, be it greenhouse gases or water usage and so on, is going to come from the private sector. And therefore, it is absolutely correct and absolutely necessary for people like us who are focused on reducing the pressures that cause the destruction and degradation of ecosystems and the loss of biodiversity. Remember, pressures are where it all begins. The impacts, in other words, the state and the extent of ecosystems is where it ends. So you need to begin at the beginning, not just jump to the end. And this leads to my time at Kali. And here I summarize the 4 big challenges and intellectual challenges that I was faced with in so many conversations. I must have had maybe 90, 100 different meetings, conversations, bilaterals, multilateral meetings. But this was the key problem that I was finding, is that there was a general misconception that, as I put it as a question, because it is food for thought, maybe it's true, but I don't think so. Does every business have to go around measuring everything everywhere all at once? Because there was a sense of, oh my God, there's not enough data. Data is scarce. And when I asked them, sorry, what data is scarce? Surely you publish your pressures, don't you? No, but we don't know which ecosystem is affected by this and which location. And yes, obviously, because that's the role of somebody else. After all, we do have IPBES and so on. Then who should be, there was this sense of confusion, generally, I would say, maybe a few exceptions, but confusion as to whose role is it to measure corporate pressures on nature, and whose role is it to measure the state of nature? So I'm going to address that a little bit. And the other missing link in people's general understanding amongst the attendees at the Biodiversity COP was the relative sizes of direct versus indirect impacts. And I'll come to discuss that for a minute, because this language is there in IPBES and in TNFD and obviously WWF. And finally, there's this, from not thinking about regeneration to thinking only about regeneration. It's a bit of a drastic change. So I just want to challenge that thought a bit. If you are regenerating X square kilometers of nature, which has been probably lost as a result of your activities, is this the same or better or worse than actually reducing your footprint so that it saves the damage of the same X square kilometers? In other words, if you reduce your biodiversity footprint, if you can measure it in square kilometers by the same X square kilometers, is that better or worse, or is it the same thing? So these are some of the questions that I want to throw at you to challenge you and challenge myself, and then let's see where we can go with this. So in order, let's begin with this whole issue of why this excessive concentration on just the direct impacts. Well, I think there's a lot of history here. And again, the definition does change. Like, I respect the IPBES definition, but it seems to bring the whole MEA drivers framework into the direct drivers definition, which means everything that is land use change, climate change, pollution, natural resource use, exploitation, and invasive species. All of these are kind of put together into the direct category. And the indirects are, if you like, the economic and the financing and the government policy pressures and the attitudes, mindsets that are driving these direct drivers to be what they are. So that's one way of looking at it. But the way that perhaps more operational people are looking at it is, for example, the way that WWF sees it, which I give above, impacts that are, for them, indirect impacts are those that are without significant direct habitat destruction, but they do degrade or undermine in some way or the other the condition of ecosystems. And that's very much aligned with the say that the TNFD, the Task Force for Nature-Related Financial Disclosure, describes it as a change in the state of nature caused by a business activity with an indirect causal link, for example, by climate change. I mean, the climate change emissions of pretty much every company are contributing to some extent to what I just described to you, the effect of the reduced size of the Amazon and other rainforests and the transition into grassland. And so I think of this whole picture a bit like this. I think of indirect and direct, determined by, are they proximate or are they distant? And typically the direct impacts are proximate, they are nearby, and the indirect impacts are distant. So what you have just referred to as telecoupling, so to speak. And the timeline also is an important thing. The direct impacts typically tend to be immediate, or if you like, in the current reporting period of the company who's causing that impact, whether it's a deforestation or damming of land for other purposes. Whereas the indirect impact tend to have a longer horizon over which they pan out. Examples, well, ecosystem level and species level, deforestation is a direct impact, maybe because of mining an area. Indirect impact could be, well, just described, greenhouse gas emissions over time, transitioning due to the power sector, transitioning a rainforest into something else. And at the species level, again, the same deforestation, maybe from the same mine, could actually lose the species if they are located in that area, if it's a endangered species and happens to be resident there. And an indirect impact could be a generic loss of river species from eutrophication due to a nearby agrochemical plant. And these are some different examples. Here's a specific example, which is, I think this example, which I'm showing you as a diagram, this is for, as it happens, a European power producer called Enel, largely Italian and so on. We have, my friends, these details available, this data, which is how much particulate matter, how much SOx, NOx, how much GHG emissions, in this case, 100.38 million tons, how much water used, in this case, 2.38 cubic kilometers of water. That's a lot of water, 2.38 cubic kilometers of water used by Enel during the year. Basically to cool thermal power plants, because even though 1/3 of them is hydropower, the remainder is significantly fossil fuel. And some small land use change in obviously operations, but and then a significant amount of non-toxic and toxic waste, which then has further impacts on nature. This level of detail, my friends, is sitting on this laptop that I'm sharing with you for 14,500 companies, pretty much the entire listed company universe. So when people complain to me that, oh, there isn't enough data, there's a paucity of data, I'm wondering, like, what are you talking about? I mean, what data do you want? You have published most of this yourself in GRI, in sustainability reports, in ESG reports, and you need to use the science which explains how this relates to impacts on nature. And that's actually what you need to do. So I come to the framework here, which is for biodiversity and ecosystems. And here's me, please. Switch off my phone, apologies. And this is the rather sort of necessarily complex way to think about the impacts of a business on nature at the ecosystem layer, at the species layer. And by the way, I don't go to the genetic layer because honestly, that is one area where there isn't. If someone complains, I don't know what is my impact on genetic biodiversity, yes, I say, fine, well, neither do I. But why don't we focus on the things that we do know about, which is at the ecosystem and species layer? And this is the framework. So we have to look at the flows. There could be forestry or forest management companies where they should take credit for ecosystem services, which are public goods and services that are generated from their forests or from the area that they manage. But equally, if they are deforesting in natural areas, then there is a loss in natural capital, and this can be measured in economic terms. At the species layer, there's a large number of ecosystem services. If you happen to be owning or managing an agricultural or natural agricultural or forestry area, yes, you should take credit for that. the visitation of species, the tourism values, the pollination values, and so on. These are species level values. And then on the other side, in terms of changes in natural capital, it is more difficult to measure species diversity change and losses, but there are two yardsticks, two metrics which are commonly used. Species richness tends to be measured in terms of PDF, potentially disappeared fraction of species, which is usually calculated through one of numerous methodologies, which I'll comment in a minute, which look at the life cycle impacts of the company. So they actually analyze the life cycle impact analysis, and they work on that basis on a very scientific, logical basis. And then lastly, so the PDF looks at the company level. So looks at this company, what is its impact on biodiversity? And that's a useful way of thinking about it. Another way of looking at it is, okay, how much is a particular area affected from last year, maybe 10 years ago, maybe 20 years ago, maybe 30 years ago? What is the mean species abundance, which is the average amount of species on average available today in that area or in that biome or in that ecosystem compared to before it was affected, with the undisturbed state, so to speak? And we can say when it was maybe 1750 or some ridiculously long time ago. So, but that is, MSA is a measurement of state of the ecosystem. It's not a measure of the pressure of the company. So again, the preference is among scientists to look at the PDF. And how do you do this? Well, thankfully, we have some help here, because people get even people at my company would have had to go through 10 different systems we knew in 2020 when we set up ours. Now, thankfully, we chose LC Impact, which, as you can see, is among the top two or three in this. And there are 23 methodologies which are looked at. Recipe, LC Impact are among the best capable in terms of the range of taxonomic groups that they cover, the number of the depth to which they cover ecosystems, and the essential biodiversity variables and so on. So there is a way forward. This study was done by a group of scientists at ISPRA, which is the European Union Research Center. And in essence, the way forward, in my opinion, is to look at these PDF numbers. And there are two independent pointers. One is independently Professor E.J. Milner-Gulan, she's the head of biodiversity at Oxford. She came out saying that, yes, she's looked at these various reports, and she concluded that there's no single biodiversity metric that's the holy grail, but that for the practical purpose of advancing corporate measurement of their impacts and what action they should take, PDF is as good as any. It's the right starting point, as she says. And then, of course, there's the much more detailed analysis by Damiani and his fellow Mattia Damiani at ISPRA and his fellow authors. So by and large, I favor looking at the life cycle impact approach. I favor using PDF, the potentially disappeared fraction of species, due to 1 year's operation of the company. And this is modeled scientifically and available through these various studies. I don't like using the MSA as a way of estimating footprint, although I have myself used it way back for the European Commission as a way of understanding what is happening at the ecosystem level, because it's an awkward force fitting. It's really a measure of state. It wasn't designed to measure pressures. And the reviewers of that approach, it's called GPS, have themselves been very critical about it. You can see this in the detailed reviews. Now, let me give you some examples. And by the way, these are pictures that I've taken from our own platform. So if you feel like you're interested, please send me an email. I'm more than happy to share this kind of analysis with you guys. So remember, there are two things that any company needs to do, direct and indirect, both, right? This is for BHP, which is a massive global mining company. It's based in Australia. So how would BHP measure its direct impacts? Well, you need to look at, okay, where are you mining versus where are the protected areas? So yes, you can go down to the detail level, and I'll give you an example. No surprises that BHP, being an Australian company, has the largest number of its mines in Australasia, in Oceania, as we call it. About half of them are exposed. We define exposed being within 1 kilometer of a WDPA, a World Database of Protected Areas. So 1/4 of BHP's mines, or 26%, are within a kilometer of a WDPA, and actually 1/4, 25%, are within a KBA. So that's a bit of a worry. And the other lens we use is to see, okay, how many IUCN endangered species or IUCN protected, threatened species are actually at risk? Well, I'll show you. So when I click here, you will see the picture. The red dots are where there's a problem. Red dot means it's close to the protected area. Blue dot means there is a mine, but it's not within a kilometer of the protected area, be it WDPA or KBA. And this is available to us through a partnership with IBAT, by the way. As some of you may be aware, the Integrated Biodiversity Assessment Tool. And then we use our own database of 2.5 million asset locations for companies to figure out what's going on. And when I go into the detail, and supposing I want to see the endangered species, I can actually go down to the location in Australia, in that location that I'm interested. And then literally it will show me which are the species. I'm just scrolling this as we speak. It is showing me which are the species, IUCN endangered species, in that location where I'm worrying about the red dot and so on. So that's the level of detail that we can get if you want. But you want it because you're a mining company. You physically affect direct impacts, as I call it, proximate, immediate, right? But there are also indirect impact. Now, this is the interesting thing, my friends. The PDF, the potentially disappeared fraction of species of BHP, the mining company, is quite large, 4.15 times 10 to the minus 4. But this is non-intuitive. You need to be a statistician or a scientist to actually make sense of 4.15 times 10 to the minus 4. So my colleagues and I said, okay, fine, let's make this easier for people. We will ask the question to the system using the LC impact method. How much natural area, that is rainforest, Mata Atlantica, Pantanal, etc., how much natural area would you need to destroy to create the same PDF? And that answer is 2,428 square kilometers. That is huge. That is huge. Now, this doesn't mean that BHP is physically destroying that area for mining. No, that's not true. They are just destroying 4, 5, 6 square kilometers. But the water they use, please look at the chart out here. The green bar is water use. That's driving potentially disappeared fraction. The yellow bar is the tailing dam waste of the company. The brown bar is the greenhouse gas emissions of the company. These are causing long distance effects, the indirect impacts. And this is, you are seeing in front of you the actual telecoupling. Now, it's maybe no surprise that it's a mining company, so you see it. But then my question to you is, okay, what if it's not a mining company? What if it's a power company? Some of you are in Germany, so RWE is a name familiar to you. Well, you know, we have the details of them as well. And this is almost as big. If you look at BHP, 2,428, RWA, 2,220. So it's not far behind. It's almost as big. Now, the nature of those impacts are mainly because of greenhouse gas emissions. Again, no surprises because of the extent of fossil fuel being used here. So the causes and the breakdown is different, but the size of the impact is comparable. And this is the challenge, that because indirect impacts tend to be long distant and over time, they tend to be invisible. You will see newspaper articles and journalists rightly indignant about direct impacts on the loss of ecosystems and biodiversity, but actually not being aware of these indirect impacts, even though they are the same sort of magnitude, order of magnitude. And it's not just about power companies and their fossil fuel burning impacts, but if I look at a large chemicals company like BASF, BASF has 670 square kilometers of impact. But again, now the mix here is quite different, right? Some of it is greenhouse, some of it is water usage, some of it is nitrogen pollution, some of it is waste, etc., etc. You can see the bar on the bottom, on the second bar on the right-hand side. That's BASF. And if we can look at a steel company like ThyssenKrupp, ThyssenKrupp has again a mix of impacts, but mainly because of the steel companies, so a lot of greenhouse gas emissions impacts. But again, this is maybe 1/4 of a large mining company, but it's not zero, it's not small, right? These are the species diversity impacts of a large steel company. And here's the key point that I want to make, and this is what I meant about an honest diagnosis. So we said, okay, let's look at in our database of almost 15,000 listed company, let us look at all of the PDFs of all the companies and look at 3 sectors which people generally worry about because it has direct impacts. Now, everyone worries about agriculture and food because, you know, gosh, that's about destroying rainforests and land use and so on, and land use change. Okay, let's look at the species impacts of those sectors, which are all of these various impacts due to mining waste, tailing dams, pollutants, chemical pollutants, eutrophication, greenhouse gas emissions, water extraction, etc. I mean, when a fossil fuel power company extracts water, remember, it puts it back into the same river or into the nearshore sea a couple of degrees Celsius higher. So even though it's clean, it's causing loss of species biodiversity in the river or in the nearshore sea. All of this is actually very significant. So when you look at it, across our massive database, which by the way covers 98% of the listed by market capitalization, it covers 98.2% of the market cap of the entire listed companies universe. So most of the invested companies data is summarized here in this diagram. And I'm looking at only 3 sectors which are associated with land use, which is food and agriculture and dairy and animal husbandry. And on the other side, I'm looking at these 3 other sectors, which people don't think about in the context of biodiversity, which is power generation, utilities, iron and steel, and chemicals. And you've just seen the size of individual companies I just showed you. This is an overall picture. The big numbers are the orange numbers, my friends. They're not the obvious numbers. This is what I meant about an honest diagnosis. When we look at it and we present it as a sectoral basis, honestly, I think policymakers and experts like yourselves, and I invite you to check out our database and to understand how the LCA, of course, it's all public data. I mean, it's all published information. So you can access it, you can replicate it. This is what needs to be understood. So now in conclusion, what can we say about the questions that I asked us? Well, no, I don't think companies need to measure everything everywhere all at once. They don't need to worry about, they don't need to become small governments and publish their NBSAPs. That's not the case. Governments do that. Companies should measure their own biodiversity footprint, and they should use any of those top-rated methodologies, maybe the top 2 or 3 or 4 of them, from the ISPRA study by Damiani et al. And the second question was, who does what? Well, companies should measure their pressures on nature, and national agencies supported by people like yourselves, IPBES and UNEP, WCMC, IUCN, et cetera, should be doing the NBSAPs. Now, I know, and David also mentioned that only 40 something or 44 of the total NBSAPs had been published, and that's bad news. But honestly, when I look at those 1,000 enthusiastic young technology people who were there at the Kali COP, this is where the connection needs to be drawn. Their technology is fantastic. It's excellent. I have seen many of them, too many of them probably. They can, using LiDAR, using drones, using all kinds of analysis and television cameras, recording cameras and so on. Yes, they can get a very good idea as to what is the state of nature and species in a particular location that is a protected area. And that's what countries need. Of course, they're not going to give you that technology for free, but that's what policy-related funding is about. These companies should be encouraged not to worry about companies and trying to pitch their data to companies, which is a wrong approach, but to pitch it to the governments using donors and using policy funding to be able to bridge the gap. That's actually what should be happening. And then hopefully we'll get NBSAPs done better and much, much faster, because the data quality and availability and processing power of these companies is fantastic. And finally, when I talk about the question of, is it only about direct impacts? No, as you can see from the numbers I've shared with you, it is a lot about indirect impacts. And the last thing is, no, it doesn't matter. Of course, it's a great thing to regenerate, and so you must, if you can, right? I began my journey into biodiversity by doing in my rainforest in Australia, which I mentioned as my favorite. I started reforesting it, and then I learned about the importance of biodiversity firsthand through planting and species reemergence. And yeah, it's good, but I'm an individual. I fly. What should Lufthansa do? What should ThyssenKrupp do? What should BASF do? What should RWE do? It's not the same thing, right? They have to figure out how do they reduce their footprints. That's a different challenge, my friends, and that's really what I want to bring to your attention and to the attention of everyone else. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Pavan, for all these insights. I think we are all really fleshed by the impact of what you've said, and we have to use these 9 minutes that are left for us for the questions that are popping up. And I start with the first one that goes, the decisive point was translating indirect emission data, water pollution, CO2 into area losses. Can you please repeat, how did you come from the emissions to the land losses or land damages?
Absolutely. So the land conversion equivalence is an equivalence. So what I'm saying is that the life cycle impact assessment works out a percentage, as in what percentage probability of disappearance of species has increased as a result of 1 year's operation of BHP or RWE or whoever it is, right? But that percentage doesn't gel. So we are saying, okay, the world is still got a significant amount of natural area. What if we took the average amount of rainforest, deciduous forests, temperate forests, wetlands, etc., and we tried to play with the same model and reduced all of that a little bit, X, right? If we reduced it by X, how much would X be in order to generate the same PDF, which is 4.15 times 10 to the minus 4? That answer is 2,428 square kilometers. And we repeat this calculation. We run the same model actually, but on the existing global ecosystem, saying on average, and that's not a bad idea. I mean, a company like BHP operates in Chile, in Canada, in obviously Australia, in Africa, in India, so many places, right? So it's kind of global in its operations. So that's not a bad model. Of course, it's an average. Of course, it's an approximation, but it's not a bad model for a big global company. So that's how we do it. We create a land conversion equivalence number to give people a sense of, okay, how much does this amount of PDF mean in terms of land area, of natural area? How much natural area would need to be destroyed to create the same pressures on species? That's how we do it.
I like the idea. So it's like then you compare it to your homeland and say it's from here to, like, say, our capital. It's a huge area, something like that. Okay.
And people get a sense of it, because it's more tangible and more intuitive in that sense.
We continue with the questions. An immediate question by David Obura is, if you have added the total land equivalent of the companies in your database, how big is this and what proportion of total land area is it? Then how does it relate to the footprints of countries and others, and also land area versus exceeding the planetary footprint? So I think it's taking your visualization in even a more complex system, right?
Right. Yes. And people often say, but the total area, if you do it, is bigger. Yeah, it's bigger because it's over time. So not everything will happen, hopefully, the way that it does. But the overall area turns out to be bigger than the total natural area available, only because it's a question of every year, here's the pressure. Every year, here's the more pressure. Here's the more pressure. So it's the question of using linear approximations versus using the remainder, percentage of the remainder. But yeah, it can be rationalized to the total natural area available. But of course, that's not where we want to go. We don't want to see the whole world's natural area destroyed. But we want to signal a warning saying that if you continue, this is what will happen. This is the rate. This is the rate of loss per year, present valued, obviously.
Now we take a look at the other side of reversing, and here's a question that goes, I'm wondering about the reverse potential of direct and indirect pressures. How can you measure this?
Absolutely. That's a great question, because one of the beauties is that using the life cycle impact assessment, if you put in a different material source, let's say you're a cement company, let's say so far you are in Kenya, it's an actual example, Kenya, and you're using sand, sorry, not Kenya, Tanzania, you're using sand from Lake Natron, which is in Tanzania. And another cement company in Kenya, not far away, is using the slag from a steel plant to use its calcium carbonate for manufacturing cement. Now, these are two totally different uses, right? Now, maybe the company in Tanzania, which is still using Lake Natron sand, where there is a population of lesser flamingos and therefore hugely damaging, maybe if it can be encouraged through an incentive or a grant by the government saying, no, please purchase or maybe co-locate with with a steel company or purchase slag from here or wherever it is, that might make a difference, because that would be a huge impactful difference in terms of if its process could be changed to change the source of the raw material that it uses. The impact on biodiversity could be a lot less. Same with energy, right? I mean, we know that energy plants which are fossil fueled are less welcome now compared to energy plants which are renewable fueled. So obviously, grants and subsidies and funding such as the US, I don't know what happens to it, but the so-called Inflation Reduction Act funding, all that policy-related funding can be directed to change the energy mix of power companies. A lot of these companies that I mentioned, they have different different sources, right? It's not, they're only not just one or the other.
I would like to add the question, how can you make these measurements really applied in politics? If, let's say, a country says, okay, we want to measure, and then force their companies to use this measurement to lower their impact in a global economy, it's hard for one country to start the application. So where do you see the most powerful approach for these numbers, not just to tell us about the impact, but really to make it lower, to make it be applied in politics?
That's a great question. And the politics will not work until sectors can be brought together. So the only sectoral initiatives that I know of have related to, let's say, the use of Pantanal area for growing soya. So the soya moratorium in Brazil and the soya consortium in Brazil is a great example of sector-based collaboration, and that's how it needs to work. You need to go sectoral, because everything, well, until trade barriers collapse, until trade barriers get reinstated, which may happen. But since the world by and large still is a global trading system, you can't really work this at a country level. You have to work on a sector by sector basis. Look at the high impact sectors and then get them together literally under the same roof in a conference and keep, I mean, instead of a conference of parties at a country level, I think the time has now come for a conference of parties at the sector level on the big impacting sectors, and we know which ones they are. So that is the approach. And then in the same room, you need to have the key countries where those companies are located or where they are registered, to provide some political pressure and maybe to provide the incentives that are needed for. Look, transition results in winners and losers. If we do nothing for the losers, then they will not change. They will wait for collapse. They will not change, right? So something has to be done for the losers, and this is where governments and their funding comes in.
Thank you so much. So we know what we have to do, and we all have to insist that the global community of scientists, but also politicians, continues to talk with each others. And Volker Mosbrugger nearly asked the same question. Now he tells me his question is answered, but I risk of saying it again, because we know on this level, he wanted to know what would be the best strategy to reduce global indirect impact on biodiversity, which was nearly my question. You said, okay, working on the sectoral level, but still you mentioned, I think we all fear it, that the global community as we know now is on the brink of being divided into countries that say, no, we deny climate change and we are fine with using fossil fuels, and others who don't. And so this makes this question even more, let's say, urgent. So what is your impact if really the global system of communication among states collapses in the way that we know it now?
So the crazy, but I believe correct answer that I'm giving you is that it's the transition period that is complicated. If the system were to collapse, then everyone knows that they have to work at the country level, and that's fine. It's the period in between that needs leadership. That needs, for example, European leaders to continue what they're doing and not be distracted by what is going to happen with Trump's decision X and Y and Z. Don't go that route, because if you keep waiting for what he decides, then you will end up in 2028 with nothing done, right? So please recognize the risk is during transition, recognize the risk needs to be taken, and recognize you need to take it because others will not. So this is because the cost of not taking action, the cost of inaction far exceeds the cost of early action.
Thank you so much, Pavan. I think we're all really impressed, and I could continue for hours with my questions, how to proceed. And I understand talking to each other on a global level is most important, and knowing that these few years are really, really important on which level ever it is. We are in a time where time also matters, even though the transition is great. Thank you so much for your work and giving us your idea how we could really improve the situation by measuring and by well, of course, taking these new idea of having sectoral conferences of the party. And then let's say biodiversity people have been so great and having these global assessments. So let's learn from these process also. Thank you so much, Pavan, for your great speech.